Woo. Okay, hi everyone. This is Reading Adam back again. Um, I'm today's video is about Catch 22. Very good book, solid book by Joseph Heller. Wow, do I even remember his name? Uh, so I recently read this book. I've been going through classics that um, I haven't read in a while or have never read, which are typically scheduled or to read during high school. So I wanted to read Catch 22. One advocate of reading Catch 22 is the Art of Manliness blog, and that blog talks about perhaps you should read a book that created a phrase that is used in society all the time to mean a hopeless situation where no choice is a good choice. And the book is rife with Catch 22, which is that hopeless choice decision. Probably every chapter involves some form of his idea of Catch 22. And it's a funny book. It's a humorous book. There's a lot of tongue in cheek. There's a lot of satire. Well, it is considered a satire, but to me, a satire is almost making fun of society or things we do in society and pointing out absurdities from doing that. So one such absurdity that comes to mind off the bat is one character's father was a farmer during the Depression, and he was paid handsomely to not grow things. So the point of being a farmer is growing things. And this guy made a fortune not growing anything because the government didn't want him to grow things. So he bought new plots of land to not grow anything. And he gave others advice about how to not grow stuff. And it was funny and also true because farmers were paid to not grow things in order to create scarcity, but still make sure the farmer had money during the Depression times. A silly program in the Depression, and Heller makes fun of a lot of stuff like that. Even the idea of war. A bunch of men, particularly one character, John Yossarian, and he's a bombardier. And this is set in World War II. He's on an island off the coast of Italy, I believe, and one guy, his commanding officer, keeps having the squadron. He keeps upping the amount of missions that they need to fly. And Yossarian's whole goal is to survive the war. He doesn't care about the war. He doesn't care about being an effective bombardier. He doesn't want to fly any missions. He just wants to leave. He wants to be done with the war. So the book starts out with him in the hospital, and he wants to stay in the hospital. He plans on staying in the hospital, but immediately there's another guy in the hospital who's jolly, happy, wants to talk to everybody, has lots of opinions, and this drives Yossarian crazy, and he gets out. He can't milk his problem anymore, and he gets out. So it's a very funny book. It was difficult for me to get through, though. I could only read small bits at a time because it was maddening at certain points. Because every character came across as crazy. There weren't really any normal people, normal characters in it. So I'm trying to. I can't think of right now likening it to something different, but if you've ever seen or read anything, you might know what I mean about where every character appears insane. You don't quite know, like the narrator isn't reliable. You don't quite know if certain things are actually happening. You might as well take him at his word and assume things are happening. But the madness of the war, the madness of each character doing whatever stupid things they're doing. Just to give an example, one that stands out to me, there's a character called Dr. Danica, and he doesn't want to be in a plane at all. And so he made a deal with the flyers that he would be on the flying roster to get his scheduled flight hours that he needs. But he's going to stay on the ground, and they're just going to pencil in his name on their flight roster, and he gets the flight hours anyway. So one time he is on the flight roster of a guy who basically commits suicide in his plane. And I forget why the guy committed suicide in his plane, which is sad because it was there was a funny reason for it. But anyway, this guy commits suicide in the plane. So just because Dr. Danica, even though he was clearly alive on the ground, talking to people, getting his blood pressure checked, and trying to convince people I'm not dead, but everybody acted as though he was dead and lamented the fact that he was dead because his name was on this roster. And why you would, if your name's on the roster, it can't possibly be that anybody faked it. It means you were actually there, and everybody believes that and acts as if that. And he just and Heller just carries this through. He just carries through this idea. And this happens so much in the book that you have to set it down at times because you feel like you're going crazy. One plot device he uses over and over to display this madness, and this happens with Dr. Danica here, is characters either repeat things, or they either repeat the opposite of what somebody's saying, or they don't go along with what somebody else is doing. Let's see if I can explain that better. It's almost like he's ramming through a certain plot. Oh man, let me give an example. So I should have thought of this ahead of time, but I wanted to have a more off-the-cuff video and see how I could do with that. And not going so well. Anyway, one example is there's a moment when Yossarian is in his plane, in the bomber, and he's trying to say something to one of the other guys in the plane, and this guy can't hear him. And no matter how angry and upset, how loud Yossarian gets, like the author writes him as if he's going literally crazy with rage and anger, and he's shouting and he's punching the guy, trying to explain something to him that's important. I don't remember what it was, but it was something important to the mission or to keeping the plane in the air. And this guy just kept being like, "What? I can't hear you," and not responding at all, having no humanity, being basically like a blob that doesn't respond and keeps saying he can't hear him, and never acts like a normal person would, who could see somebody that's clearly going nuts, trying to get your attention, trying to say something to you, and you're just like, "Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry, I can't hear you." "What? No, I'm sorry, I can't hear." Like over and over and over for pages and pages, and it gets crazy after a while. It gets frustrating as the reader to read this insanity that's going on. And he does this all throughout the book, and that's basically that's part of Catch-22. You have two choices, neither is a good choice, and the entire book is situation after situation after situation of that happening. There didn't really seem to be a plot necessarily. other than just each character's own madness and surviving through what's going on. So it's one of those books that it doesn't have a clear climax, and then it doesn't have a clear conclusion to me, other than the fact that Yossarian doesn't have to continue fighting the war, and he does something like 70 missions or something like that. The number was, I think it started at like 40 or 45, and then just kept climbing and climbing. And there was literally no way he could get out of it. He got shot in the plane once. He had many. He kept trying to convince them that he was insane, and they wouldn't. Like nothing worked. Nothing worked. And there's a lot of depth to this book. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot to think about in every chapter. Every chapter has something. That's one of the fascinating things about this book. One quick little factoid I learned about it is Joseph Heller. He was somebody who, it took him years to write this book, and he would write like a chapter or a paragraph or something, and he'd rewrite it, and he'd rewrite it, and he'd rewrite it. And it took him a very long time. I think it took him 8 years to write this book. And I think, I mean, not all classics have taken that long to write, but I guess it's just how he wrote everything he wrote. He wrote other books too, and I'd like to read some of his other books, because if you want to talk about polished, if you want to talk about really taking your story and working it and working it and working it and working it until you come up with what you want, until you say it how you want to say it, like that's this book. That's why when I read this book, Catch-22, and right now I'm currently reading The Mote in God's Eye, which is also a very good book, very fun and interesting. A great science fiction book by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. But you can tell that that book didn't take them as long to write as Catch-22. Catch-22 reads as something that was painstakingly laid out and painstakingly written. And pay attention to that when you read it. So it might take you a couple weeks or maybe a few days to read the book, but keep in mind that it took years and years of tons of work for this guy to write it. So that's one of the neat things about a book. I mean, I'm giving this video and it's off the cuff. It's live for me. It's immediate, and I can get feedback instantly, and I can rewatch it instantly. But I'm not going to record this over and over and over, and it's not going to take me like 6 months to come out with my Catch-22 video. Maybe it should, but I don't know if there's a good enough reward for that. But a lot of things that we do in life are not constantly rehearsed. They're not done to perfection. They're not done over and over and over and over and over until we get it right. Books are interesting in that you can do that with a book. You can write something down and then rewrite it and rework it and delete things and add things and rework it and rewrite it ad nauseum, ad infinitum, and still come out with something garbage or a classic or amazing. How many first drafts, rough drafts are masterpieces? Well, a book like Catch-22, reason why it became a classic is not even really because of how well written it was. It was because of the timing. It resurged. It wasn't initially that successful, but it resurged during the Vietnam War, and anti-war protesters, anti-war people in the college environment picked up this book and made it popular. So that's kind of interesting. So I think that's why, just from my impression, is that Joseph Heller's other books are just as good in terms of how well written they are and how polished they are. But Catch-22 is the one that has stuck. That has stuck because of its timing in society and culture. One other thing I was thinking is Catch-22, he uses a lot of interesting descriptive language. He uses big words. And in some instances, I felt that the words were not at all proper. They were a bit of a stretch, like when he used an adjective that he was describing one of the officers, his cheek, and the word he used, I forget the word, but the word he used was describing like a chalky substance, but it wasn't really meant, I don't think it was the word, when I looked up the definition, it didn't seem like it was meant to be a description of something, of a texture, but he almost used the word, just threw it in there as a description of texture. He only did this, I only counted maybe like 3 or 4 times where he used a word that was just completely bogus. But you know, he was really working, stretching for adding richness and descriptive power to his work. And that's another reason to read this book, is because it has better description than most books. In a humorous way, if you want to read good description in a satire setting. The other thing is, another quick example, interesting word I learned from reading this book is callipygus, and callipygus means well-formed buttocks. So interesting. Everybody, William Strunk and E.B. White, Elements of Style, English teachers, people will tell you not to use words like that. But I don't know. I like reading books that have words that I have to look up the definition. Maybe that's just me, but I find that interesting because it increases sometimes that word that just describes what you want, or maybe it rolls off the tongue like callipygus, and I think it adds a layer of depth that you can't get in other realms. Like, you can't use a word like that ever, except for in a fictional novel. And I think it's clever, yes. Does it make the author look smart? Okay, yeah, sure. But I think it adds an interesting level. It increases the interestingness of this book. Like, yes, Hemingway's very interesting, but he'll never say callipygus. Joseph Heller in Catch-22, it's interesting. And speaking of which, I'm also reading Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, and he's an excellent writer, where he uses a ton of descriptive language, ton of adjectives, and gerunds and stuff that you wouldn't normally find anywhere else. I'm becoming convinced that the mark of an excellent author is somebody who has a massive vocabulary of descriptive language that you would never be able to use except when describing life. And think about that. A good author describes life in a deeper sense. Just like how a good artist can really capture, or a good photographer can really capture an image, a moment, so too can a good writer describe a moment. And sometimes you need a massive vocabulary, but a massive vocabulary, basically access to a thesaurus, isn't enough. A truly wise and exceptionally talented author chooses the right words and the right descriptions, and it comes off wonderfully. And I think Lolita is a good example of that. The guy clearly has complete mastery of the English language, and you almost want to read literally anything he writes on any topic because of the richness of his language and his accurate usage of that vocabulary. That's one thing that I really like about Evelyn Waugh's novels. He's also one of those authors who has a vocabulary that's extremely large, complete mastery over the English language, and a love for language. And so you see that through his descriptions. He uses the right words to describe the right things in the right way possible. And sometimes you don't know what that is until you read an author of that caliber. I think that's partly what separates the men from the boys in the author's realm. There was another point I was thinking in my mind as I was saying that, and I can't recall. I don't want to have a lot of dead air, dead time, and I'm trying to swing back to Catch-22. Let's see if I can think back what it was. No, it's not going to come back to me while I'm doing this, and I don't want to waste your time by doing that. So the richness of language, being able to use in-depth language. Oh man, I'm really getting, I'm really kind of rambling here because I've lost my train of thought. Let's go back to something let's go back to Catch-22, this book, this author, rewriting it over and over and over again to really get it polished. Yet some things were quite not polished enough. I don't know if that's a problem of the editor. Could have been. I think some parts of the book could have used some clipping, some editing. There are a lot of funny instances in the book where there's a point near the end where one of Yossarian's friends, he had a whore in Rome that he was in love with, but then that's the guy who committed suicide. And Yossarian goes and it tells this to the prostitute, and she tries to kill him, and there's a very long fight scene between Yossarian and this prostitute. And I find, I don't know why, maybe it's just because I'm a young guy still, but I find action scenes to be, like, I just fly through reading action scenes. They're so interesting. They're suspenseful. It keeps, like, you really want to read through it and find out what that is. I find reading actions to be so much more interesting and rewarding, and I read a lot faster but still soak everything in than when I read dialogue or setting, or I'm trying to figure out why this person is saying this and who this character is, and I forget who this other character is. Action sequences are very clear. It's easy to understand what's happening, because otherwise it would muddle so badly that the author would have to throw it out entirely. But a dialogue sometimes contains clever things, or maybe little quips or jokes that perhaps only the author gets, and that's harder for me to get. But action sequences are very clear, crisp. They're tight. They tend to be well written. In Catch-22, there was only a few times where he had action sequences, and I found those to be my favorite parts of the book. I tend to like sections of books that have an action sequence. Very little do I like a lot of talking in books, which is odd, because, I mean, how do you really advance a lot of things? But a lot of characters, how they think is another big aspect, and there wasn't too much of that in Catch-22. Not too much of how characters think. If I were to ask a student to write an essay on this book, or if I were to write an essay on this book, you would strictly want to focus on Catch-22, the idea of two difficult choices to make, and you'd want to write about how moments in your own life have been a Catch-22, and maybe even, choosing between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was probably a Catch-22 situation for many people. Maybe every single election ever is a Catch-22. there's a lot of things like, do I go to college and require tens of thousands of dollars of debt, or do I stay at home and work a minimum wage job for an undetermined amount of time? Catch 22. It's most of us are going to come across that where both choices we have. Maybe we only have two choices, and both choices are bad. It's going to happen a lot. So I think that's probably why it's an interesting concept. A lot can be discussed there between people. And if you think about it, you can probably think of times in your own life where you've had a catch-22. It's well worth the read. It's a very good book, well worth reading. It starts off a bit slow because you're not quite sure what's happening, and if you don't get the satire right away, it can be confusing. And that was some trouble I had with it. I couldn't just read it straight through. I couldn't read it for more than an hour at a time. Some books you can sit and read and you want to finish it, you want to get through it, and you're loving it. But this book, I had difficulty because the madness gets to you after a while. Anyway, that's my take on Catch-22. Glad I read it. And I do look forward to trying one of Joseph Heller's other books. I'll probably have to try to get it on my phone because his stuff tends to be, it tends to be when there's one major successful book like Catch-22 or Fahrenheit 451, you can't find the author's other books. Like, you can never find them, and oftentimes you don't even think they wrote anything else. What is interesting, last point here, is Catch-22 was Joseph Heller's first book that he wrote, and it's a classic, and it's amazing. So if you ever think your first is going to suck or is going to turn out terrible, keep in mind Joseph Heller and Catch-22. Also keep in mind it took him 8 years to do it. He rewrote and he rewrote and he rewrote, and he was an English professor of creative writing. And so, he was in his element, and he was real. But even though he was trained in this, taught this in his element, he still took his time with it and really worked hard on it. And by that, he was able to come up with something very successful from it. So keep that in mind as life advice. Ponder that. Meditate on that. Okay, Reading Adam. Then again, check out my blog. Like this video, share this video, leave a comment below, subscribe if you will, and you'll see me next time when I finish my next book. Thanks. Bye.